I'm going to be frank here. Starter ships, in the entire spectrum of them, from the good old Aurora to the new 300 series ships, and everything in between. A lot of these ships either don't really have a place in the game, or they are absurdly powerful for what they are, relatively speaking of course. It's gotten to the point to where a de facto meta has formed around the starters, in a very unhealthy way, so I'm going to talk about it. To make this easy on me, and to limit any confusion at all, I'm going to define the different types of starter ships. But before I do, I'm going to make it clear for the peanut gallery, in the same way that transport ship does not differentiate between the Genesis and the 890 jump, or how the term fighter doesn't differentiate between the Arrow and the Vanguard. Starter as a term doesn't differentiate between these ships. It's a vague term, to give you a general idea of what these ships are made to do. Nothing more. Additionally, before someone accuses me of quote unquote making up definitions and phrases, I'm simply describing the term CIG uses. Also, as an aside, we are going to play a little game. You have to take a shot of hot sauce after this sentence every time I say starter. Once you've done so, if you can guess the number of times I say starter correctly, I'll give you a gift of some sort. Anyways, to start, we'll look at tier 1 starter ships. Tier 1 starters are, in a sense, the most basic ship that can navigate on its own and has some utility that can be upgraded into point. These are ships intended for starting the game into, and thus allowing a player to experience starting activities. As such, they are pretty generic in their use cases. Each base hull in this tier has variants, and these variants have more or less the same functionality, with the exception being the Mustang Gamma and Omega, which are dedicated racing ships, and even then, these ships are pretty close to the functionality of other Mustangs. The ships that makes up this class are the Auroras, the Mustangs, and the 100 series of ships. Then you have tier 2 starters. Tier 2 starters are uncharacteristically different from the rest of ship balance, in that they are designed to be generally better than tier 1 starters. They do generally the same thing as tier 1 starters, but, as you can see in many of the starters Q&As, are generally more defined in their roles. This is especially true for their variants, which are often in comparison to the next type of start more so than a traditional starter ship. In tier 2, the ships in question are the Reliant, 300, and Avenger series of ships, and to be more specific, the base models, being the Reliant Core, the 300i, and the Avenger Titan are the ships most tied to the tier 2 label. Also, as a side note, most of the issues with balance of starters exists within this category of ships, so I will talk about this part the most out of any other starter. Lastly, you have profession starters. Profession starters are small ships not associated with combat, are not a fighter, instead occupies roles in which are specialist in nature, roles in which the traditional starter ships do not occupy under normal circumstances. However, they are meant as a starting branch in these categories that they occupy, and thus have a lower capability, usually due to size. As I alluded to earlier, the tier 2 starter variants would fit into this section of starter more than being a traditional starters. Also, any other small specialist ship, like the Herald, the Prospector, the Vulture, and more would also fit into this category. Now that we know what starters are, let's talk about how they are broken. Interestingly enough, the problem has nothing to do with the in-between. In fact, due to them all being small ships, they are pretty well balanced between the different starter types. Where things become dysfunctional is within the types, as there you find fundamental problems with the ship's structures, leading into how they perform, which is usually horribly. Thus, a very obvious meta forms, to the detriment of quality. To open up the topic, I'm going to go through type by type, and explain the problem ship's issues, and ways they could possibly be fixed, which hopefully will bring about a less monotonous state of affairs, when it comes to perceived ship choice. Starting with tier 1 ships, I'm going to go ship by ship. Starting with the Auroras, and I gotta say, woo lad. The lineup of Auroras do not make much of any sense at all, especially if you consider their pledge cost. Let me show you with some charts. In order to make a somewhat readable chart, I've narrowed down the list of things to the base stats, things that are important. Auroras are remarkably similar between the hulls, with a lot of their stats being the same. Thus, I slimmed it down to the things that are different between at least one hull, apart from the cargo capacity, which was brought in to highlight how utterly useless the CL is. As you can see right here, the CL is the most expensive pledge in the entire loop. Yet, it's the most lackluster, it being the cargo variant. It comes with an empty store-all box for some reason. In the current game, it's been rigged to carry 6SCU vs the other Auroras, but eventually, that rigging won't matter, as they have all been made to carry 6SCU of cargo. It's also the slowest and least maneuverable Aurora, coming in last place on both accounts due to using poor base equipment. Then, on top of all of this, it's got the worst weapons you can get for an Aurora, with 4 times S1 weapon hardpoints, and a single S2 missile rack open for use. On top of the silliness, that is the Aurora, if you look carefully, you'll notice that there seems to be a group of Auroras that are functionally the same ship, that being the MR, CL, and ES. Noticing that, I realize that the Aurora platform as it's currently portrayed makes little sense to the systems CIG are building out, such as the cosmetic customization system they've been parading around for the last 3 weeks, whilst pimping out the 300 series in the meantime. Thus, I made another just exquisite chart to show how this can be restructured. So there, we got rid of 2 ships in the line, namely the ES and the CL. These can simply become customization options. Furthermore, due to the eventual additions with components, the speed and maneuverability of the 3 ships should be equal to each other. Obviously cargo is the same, which then leaves the hardpoints and the pledge cost of the Auroras. For the hardpoints, you could simply make it a thing of having 3 separate hulls as there is now. Assuming that there's going to be aftermarket shops that'll allow you to upgrade in between the hulls, this structure is fine, as it'll give people starting with Auroras a sense of initial progression. That leaves pledge cost. I made it to where the current costs are not changing, with only the CL getting a downsizing in pledge cost technically, due to merging with the base Aurora. To be honest, I don't really care about the pledge costs in the first place, but if you want to hash out those in the comments, that's fine by me. Moving on. Next you have the Mustangs. Mustangs are the second ship line that CIG made for tier 1 starters, and yet somehow, they are also somehow not messed up. In fact, it's so well designed across the entire lineup that I'd say is perfect, in a conceptual sense. In fact, if it wasn't for the probable high maneuvering capabilities of the 100 series, I'd probably be making the case that it should be regarded as a tier 2 starter ship line. Speaking of the 100 series, they are some of the weirdest ships in the entire game in terms of ship balance. The ship line is on one hand very powerful, as it can efficiently burn up pretty much any kind of gas at once, and collect fuel handedly in such a small ship, making maneuvering, especially in atmosphere for extended periods of time, quite easy of a choice to make, even if CIG comes to their senses, and gives back peoples and takes on other light and medium fighters. And with its design, it looks as if it should be quite a maneuverable craft in atmosphere. However, and, of course, for every variant, they have the vital bed to log off from. However, as far as benefits go, that's all there is. Acceleration remains to be seen, but speed, as of current, for all models is frankly terrible. Aurora levels even, and even on the 125A. This leaves the 125er and the 100I to be anemic at best in regards to usability, leaving the 135C to be actually decent as a starter ship. I'm not actually sure what should be done in regards to these 2 ships to make them better, and frankly, I don't really care all too much, with them being dirty imperialist pig origin ships, but if they were to be balanced, something would need to be done with them. Now that the little baby ships have been handled, we can move on to the slightly less baby ships. In fact, if we look at the conceptual age, these are some of the oldest ships in the game. Yes, I'm talking about the tier 2 ships. Given that they've all been refreshed in the last year or so, this gives me all new numbers to look at, and frankly, it's a hot mess. To make this easy, I'm just going to compare ships that are similar in their roles. Any ship that are unique in their roles between these 3 ship classes I'm deeming balanced due to a monopoly of their role as a tier 2 starter. This includes the 350R, which is an entirely separate issue. To start out, I'm going to go right off the bat and look at the cargo ships. For this, I'm picking the 315P for being the de facto hauler from the 300 series, as it has the most cargo in the series, as well as out of any tier 2 starter, which we'll get to later of course. Then the Reliant Core for being the only Reliant with any quote unquote decent amount of storage for it, and lastly the Avenger Titan, being the only Avenger with cargo storage. As I stated, the 315P tops all three of these ships for cargo, having the most out of any of them, and has the most range out of all of them, given its extended small QD tank. How the 315P became this powerful, I'm not even sure. However, it's not all bad. The Avenger Titan still has its place, given that it is a better combat vessel, having more firepower than the 315P. What does that leave the core? Well, nothing actually. The core has no real benefit over the Avenger Titan or the 315P. Its structure is weaker, it's slower and less maneuverable than both other ships, and uses the same amount of fuel. Even though it's supposed to have some special Zern thrusters, its cargo, even though by its description should be higher, is actually lower than both ships. It's got comparable firepower to the 315P, but is bested on concentrated fire or DPS by both ships, and the economics of any of the ships are worst for the core, as utilizing the ship in the fullest requires not 1, but 2 people on board, and given that the core is also the worst earner in between all 3 of these ships, also puts it at being the worst ship in between these 3, perhaps even between all starters in regards to economics. Given that the core is in such a bad shape, I've made a thread on Spectrum detailing what I think it would take to actually fix the core. I'm putting it in the description, so you can read through my entire thought process. Now we move on to combat ships, which would be the Reliant Tanner, Avenger Warlock, and 325A. Now, looking past the issues with the Reliant hull, and any real number issues between the 3 ships, I believe that these 3 ships are balanced. Even though they are all pure combat ships, they all go about it differently. The Tanner is more like a tiny dropship, a little bad in space if you will. The Warlock is a newer ship with a fat distortion field generator in the back. Out of all of these, the 325er is the only one in which performs similarly to that of a single-seater fighter in the totality of the design. Thus, past the number balancing, I think will work out well. Outside of combat and cargo however, there's no solid comparison that can be made between the 3 hulls, so, as I said before, is balanced. This now leaves the profession starters. Given there's quite a few of them, I'm only going to look at what ships needs to get a look on the mechanics and design for them. To start off, the Hawk needs better ways of capturing people. As we can see now with bounty hunting, and will most likely see even harsher, when NPCs will be able to QT away from combat, the Hawk won't have any solid way of making a character stay put long enough to kill or capture them. This could possibly be solid by simply making ships not be able to QT whilst under the effects of distortion damage, so say overloaded effect, that needs to be built up from constant damage application. The Prospector simply needs the filtration unit to be made finally. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. The rest is simply mechanics that are needed to be created. Now, if you excuse me, I need to give my master a back. I mean take my fish to the vet.